I speak to you in the name of God, who is Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier. Amen. I invite you to be seated. Well, had I known ahead of time what was in store for us weather-wise, I might have taken a slightly different tact on this sermon, which is focused on that kind of apocalyptic gospel passage we just heard. I could have used the storm blowing outside as a sign of terrible things to come. But in fact, I think had I gone that direction, I would have not been so faithful to the reading that Matthew records for us. Now, Matthew would have written this about the year 80 of the Common Era. That is about 50 years after Jesus had walked the face of the earth, after he had lived among us and died on the cross and rose again. Now, early after Jesus' death, the early Christians were eagerly anticipating his return. But as you can well imagine, some 50 years later, the edge had kind of worn off. Life had gotten kind of ordinary, did not have that keen sense of expectation that filled the church earlier. Sounds a little bit like our day, where most of the time we are not in the midst of storms that get us anxious about what's going to happen. Most of the times our lives look rather ordinary. But it is into those ordinary lives that Matthew is speaking today, using an account of this moment in Jesus' life. This is shortly after he has kind of been tossed out of the temple and is approaching the end of his earthly days. And he gives this story of the coming of the Son of Man, which Matthew recounts, and then Matthew adds 4 other more detailed, kind of specific situations that Jesus offers to people living ordinary lives. Now, it is interesting to note that in Matthew's account, he includes in this apocalyptic vision that Jesus offers the account of Noah. And I want to point this out because it kind of runs against what one might see in the media and preached at other pulpits about what the end times might look like. You might hear people speak of the rapture and how everything is just going to get horrendous in our earth, and only those believers will be swept away ahead of time, and all the rest, poor saps, will be left behind. But consider the Noah story, that great flood account, when nearly everyone is wiped out. Who is left behind? Noah, his family, the faithful ones. They are left behind to repopulate the earth with that promise that God would never again destroy the earth, with that opportunity to live in continued faithfulness for how God had the earth and all of creation, God's intention for it to be a place of loving community, of right relationship with God, with one another, and with ourselves. So I'm going to take that slant on what Jesus says today in the gospel. But I'm going to try and bring it down to our day and age, first by taking it down to their day and age, and then offering up some what I think are hopeful examples of how people of faith are living into what Matthew would say is already the end times. We are living in the end time age, that between the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and his coming in glory to dwell among us again. So Jesus' illustrations, first off, of what do we do with this message of the coming of the Son of Man. He talks about ordinary people of his day, like slaves. And he sets the example of the slave who's faithful when his master is gone away, and how he is rewarded when the master returns, unlike the unfaithful slave who is doing his or her own thing when the master returns and judgment is cast upon that person. Or that other story that might be familiar to you of 10 bridesmaids waiting with eager anticipation of the coming of the bridegroom, that the wedding celebration might continue, might begin. 5 of those bridesmaids are wise and keep their lamps filled with oil and the wicks trimmed so that when the bridegroom arrives, they'd be ready. 5 were foolish. I don't know what they were thinking about. Something other than the bridegroom's arrival. They were out of oil by the time the bridegroom arrived. And they were left out in the dark, missing the celebration. Jesus contrasts slaves who are faithful. Once again, in the story of the talents, some were given 5 talents, other 2 talents, a measure of resources in that day. And one was given 1, and when the master returns, he rewards those who use what they had been given to do good things with those resources. One kind of ignored the fact that the master was going to return someday, buried the money, and had nothing to show for that time when the master was away. And finally, in his 4th example, and the one that leads most clearly into our own day, Jesus contrasts the righteous who are feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked, caring for the sick, and visiting the imprisoned. And he says, you are doing this for me and to me. But it is so a part of their character, out of their faithfulness for so long, that they almost didn't recognize the significance of what they were doing. Jesus contrasts that to those who were unfaithful, had lost their own actions as a part of this grand scheme that God has designed. They didn't even recognize that every time they turned away from the poor or the hungry, every time they ignored those who were imprisoned, that they were in fact ignoring God's call on their life, God's call to be servants. So what does that look like in our day? And on this Sunday, first Sunday of Advent, a Sunday where we mark hope, I thought I would focus on a number of examples I see in and around our community of hope, and how people of faith play a big part, and in fact could play an even larger part in bringing hope into a dark world. Yesterday I had the pleasure of being at the film house at 2:00 in the afternoon for what was entitled the Better Cities Film Festival. The place was filled with architects and designers and planners and concerned citizens who want to see St. Catharines and other municipalities in Niagara become better cities, cities where all are welcomed, where people can move about the place in environmentally sound ways. There were movies, it was a series of movies from all over the world where people are intentionally trying to do good things to make our communities more livable, sustainable. And I was thrilled to see other people of faith gathered in that group. You know, we have something going for us with this assurance of God's desire to transform all of creation to what God had in store for it from the beginning. I think of last Wednesday when I was in attendance at a Niagara Poverty Reduction Network roundtable meeting with Father Will Alakis from St. Columba. Here's a gathering of people, there were about 30 there, many from various social service agencies, from the government, who want to not only address the immediate needs of the most vulnerable people in our community, but they actually want to work together to address basic causes of poverty in our community. They have a vision that it doesn't have to be the way it is right now. You see, that vision of hope, that vision that things should be different than they are, is not confined to the church, because the Spirit blows not just in the walls of this building, but across the globe. One of the joys of my job as the Director of Social Justice and Outreach and Community Engagement is that I get to look around us for where that Spirit is moving and invite all of you to look around and see it and find where God is calling you to come alongside. One of the places people come alongside is when there are events around the issue of truth and reconciliation. as non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people try and move forward towards better relations, to find healing from the damage that has been done through colonialization. And one of the encouraging words I received was from Darcy Belanger, a local Indigenous leader, who is talking about truth and reconciliation in various events that are held from time to time in our community. And he said, when they're in a church, when church people are invited, they show up. And you could see happiness in him that people would show up. And sometimes that is all the call that we are asked to respond to, is to just show up and be present and be what is for others a sign of hope, a sign that in fact the world is changing. And we can say that faithfully because of what Jesus Christ has done. And I won't go into detail about two ministries that are so near and dear to our hearts because they are so familiar to us. The breakfast program and now the STEP program. But I will say, it is an amazing thing to see people's eyes light up when a perfect stranger to them smiles and says good morning, or welcomes them with a bowl of cereal or porridge. Simple things, ordinary things that can happen on very ordinary days can make a huge difference in a person's life. And don't underestimate the impact that sharing your faith with someone else can have on them. When I pray with someone in the STEP program, when the occasion feels right and they are open to that opportunity, we have been blessed by tears of healing rolling down cheeks that have known tears of pain for too long. When they hear that blessed message that they are beloved children of God, and where they find a place where they are treated as such, and where they are encouraged and are offered a message of hope. Hope is the blessing that I pray for each and every one of us today. Because if we can leave with that gift and spread it around, the day of the Lord is drawing ever near. Thanks be to God. Amen.